All right, so next we're going to look at violence in sport. And in terms of sport and society, looking at sociology in sport, violence is really a different component of deviance. And that's why I separate this into two lectures. Because violence really has, in sports, it has its own definitions and its own examples. So it really warrants its own section. And so with this section for us, we're going to look at some definitions of violence and aggression, some different types of violence, and then to wrap it up, you all are responsible for watching the film League of Denial, which is on our D2L site. And that looks at the issue of concussions in in football in general. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before you go any further, pause this presentation and click on this YouTube link. It's a compilation of the perceived top 10 sports fights of all time. So it has some clips from hockey, football, both high school or collegiate and pro, NASCAR of all things, and baseball. As you watch the clip, pay attention to how you're reacting. Your thoughts about the fights. I was talking about this with my son last night because I was going to show him. I said, I feel bad because some of these I really find hilarious and I enjoy watching them. And I kind of feel that as a teacher of this class, I should be condemning the violence and be like, hey, this isn't cool. But part of it is we think, hey, that's part of the game. I really like the clip where, and see, I'm laughing as I talk about this and I sort of feel bad, but the clip where the batter kicks the catcher in the head to give him more time to charge the mound. Because typically what we see in baseball is the catcher will help protect his pitcher. So if a player acts like he's going to charge the mound, the catcher will intervene. My favorite, honestly, is number 4 with Nolan Ryan. So check that one out. Now, our reactions aren't wrong per se, but they do tell us a lot about how our culture views violence in sports. So let's get started. But again, make sure that you watch that clip before going any further. So let's look at a few terms, the difference between violence and aggression. So violence involves using excessive physical force. And so it can cause harm or destruction or has the potential to cause harm or destruction. Aggression, it can be both verbal or physical and has the intention of dominating, controlling, or doing harm to another person. I think in just everyday thought, we probably combine violence and aggression to mean the same thing, but technically they are different. They can occur separately and they can occur together. Violence can be a component of aggression or stem from aggression, but aggression doesn't always involve violence. In addition, you can also be violent without being aggressive. And that sounds like an oxymoron or very contradictory, but hitting hard in hockey is a violent action. But you may be doing it to do it because that's what you do in that situation. You're not trying to dominate or do harm to another person. But again, that can be hard to determine because we don't know what's going through the individual's head as they put that hit on somebody. So this is an interesting court case, and the reason why I include it is because there's a lot of talk now about football and concussions and just the danger of the sport, but this was a court case from back in 1979, and it wasn't a criminal case, it was in civil court, but it looked at the involuntary reflex defense regarding aggressive contact during a sports contest. So a Cincinnati Bengals football player had hit a Denver Broncos player on the back of the head out of frustration after an interception. So the play was over. He, in essence, gave him a sucker punch. He hit him from behind when the player wasn't looking. Unfortunately, the Broncos player broke 3 vertebrae and suffered several muscular injuries as a result. Now, at the district court level, and this is an interesting quote, it said both offensive and defensive players must be extremely aggressive in their actions, and they must play with reckless abandonment of self-protective instincts. So to me, that's really fascinating. It's saying, hey, this is the nature of the sport. So injuries can and will happen, and it's part of the game. But that ruling was appealed and overturned. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision, and it stated that even a football player may be held responsible for injuring an opponent if he acts with the reckless disregard for the opponent's safety. So the hit from behind, the sucker punch, taking someone out when they're not looking, that you can be held accountable for. Getting injured in a tackle in a normal routine play? No. So let's look more specifically at the 4 types of violence on the field. And we're really looking at these from least severe to most severe, just to orient you as we get going. So the first one is brutal body contact, which actually sounds pretty severe, but it's actually the least problematic type of violence. And this contact is very common, it's accepted, and it's expected. It's not seen as illegal or criminal. So you have things like the enforcer role in hockey, or laying someone out in hockey. That's seen as, yes, it's brutal body contact, but it's accepted and expected. It is the most difficult type of violence to control because it is part of the sport. And about 90% of the serious injuries in these sports occur within the rules of the games and contests. And so I've included a clip. Scott Stevens is a very well-known hockey player who actually, I tried to find the video of his top 10 best hits, which I used to use in this class, but it had been taken down. But he is portrayed in a very interesting way by the announcers in terms of his hits. So check out that clip and see what they say. The second type of violence on the field is the borderline violence. And this includes actions or practices that violate the rules of the game, but they're accepted as useful competitive strategies. So I have 2 clips here to show examples. One is the brushback pitch in baseball, where essentially you throw up and in at a player's head or close to their head, kind of a warning, back off, or or whatever it's for. There's a really famous example. Some of you who are baseball fans will remember a pitcher, I believe played for the Mariners. I think, was it the Mariners or the Diamondbacks? Anyway, Randy Johnson, big, tall, lanky left-hander, could throw super fast, just an amazing pitcher. And there's a story of how a player came up to bat from another team, totally forgot he was facing Randy Johnson, and he dug in the box, meaning like he kind of dug into the dirt and got set. And then he looked up and realized it was Randy Johnson, and he tried to kind of back out of that, and Johnson threw at his head. And if you've ever seen like a 99-mile-an-hour fastball coming in at your head, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's just another aside. But the brushback pitch is part of the game in baseball. Also, the push-off in football, both at high school, collegiate, and pro level. This is a clip of a push-off in a high school football game. But that's seen as a rule breaker. And if you're caught for it, you can be flagged, but oftentimes people get away with it. And it's seen as a useful competitive strategy. Here's where we start to get more serious. The first one is quasi-criminal violence. And so these practices or actions violate the formal rules of the game, can violate public laws, informal norms, and really athletes condemn these. So your cheap shots, your late hits, your sucker punches, your flagrant fouls, those are seen as very inappropriate, and they usually result in fines and suspensions. So I've included 2 clips to illustrate this. The first one is really a compilation of some sucker punches, and one announcer calls a hockey player's punch left-handed larceny. So I included that because I think it's fascinating that they really attached a criminal descriptor to the sucker punch, because larceny is a crime. The next one is really sad in many ways because it's a coach sucker punching a referee at a youth football game. So disturbing on many levels, but again, another example of quasi-criminal violence. And last but not least is criminal violence. So these are actions or practices that are clearly outside the law. Athletes condemn them without question, and they can be prosecuted as crimes for things such as assault or something. So you have 3 videos here that you can look at. And one of the things that's become very unfortunate and has been highly publicized because it's occurring more and more is attacks on officials. And the second video it really is disturbing. Like the video itself says it's, watch this, but it's disturbing. Where two high school football players just totally take out a referee just from behind. They blindside him. And it's unfortunate. And there was debate, I don't know what happened, about whether they would charge them as adults for their actions. So you can look at these different videos and see, again, this criminal violence. Soccer referees are getting attacked more and more often. So let's look at violence and masculinity, because really to understand violence in sports, we have to look at gender ideology and what a culture emphasizes as important. And in American culture, we emphasize masculinity. And so because of that, males will often view aggression as legitimate and natural. So if you're an aggressive player or an aggressive athlete, it helps prove your masculinity. So you avoid those labels such as wuss or sissy or wimp. Oftentimes, players are also evaluated in terms of their ability to do violence in combination with physical skills. So if you can lay a good hit on somebody in addition to being fast, or, what is it about, are you a hard hitter? And thinking about it, I even, we tend to view this a little bit as natural, but it doesn't excuse it. And it shows how we're socializing our youth and players to show aggression as a component of their gender ideology. So there's a quote on here with Ozzie Guillen, who's a former Major League Baseball player and then became a coach. And he was talking about a specific play in 2004 where there's a collision between a catcher and a player. It was a pretty violent collision. And he says, quote, "If we don't like it, we should go and play softball or go play tennis. I don't want them to be a bunch of ladies playing this game." Now, if he'd said that now, there would be a ton of public outcry with the Me Too movement and some other things going on. But at the time they said this, it was largely ignored. And as a softball player and coach, I kind of find it offensive, but that's neither here nor there. But again, this perception that if you're a male and playing sports, you have aggression and violence. They go hand in hand with your identity as an athlete. We also see a language of violence. Words such as, "We're going into battle. We're going to win this battle. I'll destroy him." So our language that we use within the context of sports also enforces this aggression and this idea of masculinity. We also see that violence is used as a strategy. We talked already about the brushback pitch and the push-off, specifically with the enforcer in ice hockey. So I love this clip because it has different players talking about whether or not the headshots and the enforcer is really needed now. So they look at really just some pros and cons from the perspectives of the players about this aspect of hockey. Most importantly to understand is we have violence built into our sports, and it's been built into the culture, into the structures, and the strategies of a sport. So it becomes much more difficult to control or eliminate it. And so we can say, hey, what do we do? But it's going to take time. We have to change the culture of sports. We have to change those aspects and attitudes that emphasize violence in order to get rid of the violence. So we need to also look at violence in female athletes. There's been increasing attention devoted to female athletes who are violent, and I just realized I have a typo on this slide. It's actually supposed to be 2011 or 2010 with Brittany Griner. But some of you may be familiar with Brittany Griner, and she was heralded as a freshman coming out of high school. She went and played for Baylor University, and I actually saw her first collegiate game. It was against it was season opener against UT Knoxville, and I saw it in Knoxville. But she had to learn very quickly about physicality in collegiate basketball, and she got pushed around a lot. And her coach tried to help her adjust to that, but at one point, when they were playing Texas Tech, which was a conference game, she punched a Texas Tech player. And little attention was given to the fact that Griner was essentially getting manhandled and pushed around under the basket. But they used a descriptor such as Griner punched the Texas Tech player, throwing her like a rag doll with a haymaker. So using descriptors that drew attention to Griner and essentially labeling her a thug for one punch. So it was a really interesting scenario because it got a lot of attention. And part of that comes from being female and but also being a very widely touted player. And so there was a lot of attention on her. There's also the example of Elizabeth Lambert. And if you watched the clips that I've posted so far, you've seen the example of her, where a soccer player who, in the course of one game, tripped a player, tackled a player, kicked a ball into a player's face, grabbed a player's ponytail, and yanked her down to the ground. Nothing happened to her during the course of the game, but she was suspended after the game. And then the next YouTube clip is a 2015 fight between two collegiate women's basketball teams. And it got so out of control, the cheerleaders actually got involved and led to one team voluntarily removing itself from playoff contention. And the other one had, I believe, 7 players suspended. So there was a total of 15 players suspended after this fight. But why are we seeing more female athletes being violent? Well, one train of thought is that there's too much pressure being put on all athletes, both male and female. Pressure to dunk, to pitch a perfect game, to run the perfect race. And that pressure is not realistic. Just because you're playing college sports doesn't make you perfect. And so people can break under that pressure. They can react as a result of that pressure. And so coaches need to be role models and teach sportsmanship. Players should be benched for that type of behavior, such as Elizabeth Lambert. Kim Mulkey Robinson, although she's now Kim Mulkey, gave Griner an additional 1-game suspension beyond the NCAA penalty. So she went beyond that to say, hey, we're not going to tolerate this behavior. We also see social expectations and the media, and these kind of go hand in hand. We don't expect females to be violent. So for males, when they get in a fight, it's like, no, yeah, that's normal. But for females, it's more alarming. It's seen as, what's happening? These are supposed to be, our moms, our future moms, sisters, girl down the street or whatever. And so people find fights with women more alarming. Also, the media likes to sensationalize this type of bad behavior from female athletes. So again, when you do see, all athletes, males and females, have pressure. They have emotions running high in the games. They're highly competitive. There's nothing about being male or female that differentiates your competitiveness. But the media does, when they see fighting or things from female athletes, they like to sensationalize it, blow it up, make it bigger than it is. So let's wrap up by looking at the sport of boxing and then approaches to curbing violence. And so in this class, we really haven't talked a lot about boxing, but boxing is a good sport to examine in light of violence. And there's 2 trains of thought regarding boxing. One is that it's a barbaric sport, and the other is that it's very beneficial. The benefits, take into account the experience of the athletes. So it's, a good sport. It's going to keep kids off the street. Low-income kids have an outlet for their frustration. Kids learn character development and discipline, the merits of hard work. People can climb up the socioeconomic ladder. You can be aggressive in a socially accepted way. A lot of these are the benefits of all sports in general, but it is true of boxing, especially. It's emphasized. However, if you look at boxing itself, the goal is to beat someone up. You're trying to beat them up to submission or into unconsciousness. So there was a match in Australia, and the Australian Medical Association Queensland president said the fighter's death showed why boxing should be banned nationally. He told ABC, quote, "We believe that a so-called sport where two people knock each other in the head as often as you possibly can to win a bout seems rather barbaric." He continued on, "You're not allowed to hit the organs beneath the belt, whereas you're allowed to hit the organ above your shoulder, which is the most important organ in the body." So he's stressing that boxing in and of itself, while it's a revered sport, it's designed to hit your head, which houses your brain. And in light of all the things we're discovering about the consequences of multiple concussions, the neurological problems, depression, suicide, the other brain damage, the chance of fatality. So there is a push in some circles to lessen the violence of boxing, if not to eliminate it altogether. So what do? If you remember our discussion from deviance in sport, we looked at two approaches: the absolutist approach, which is more black and white, and the constructionist approach, which said, hey, we've got to look at these actions within the social context. So two trains of thought or approaches that we can take to address violence in sports. So the first one is with the absolutist approach is, hey, make the actions criminal. We're going to give penalties for infractions. If they commit A, B, C, or whatever, then this is the penalty. One and done. So in light of all the assaults on officials, Michigan was considering passing a law. And if you assaulted a referee, you would receive it would be considered a felony. You could be in prison for up to 3 years and receive a $10,000 fine. And Michigan, if they passed this, would join 23 other states that have laws on the books regarding assaults on referees. The constructionist approach says, hey, we can have laws. There's nothing wrong with that. But what can we do to create a safer environment? So this looks at, again, changing the nature of all the individuals involved in sports to promote a safer environment and curb violence. So by training coaches, train your coaches on how to supervise children in a professional, sportsmanlike, and age-appropriate manner. If you've ever watched Friday Night Tykes, and that's a reality show that looks at youth football leagues in Texas, it'll blow your mind. These coaches are telling their kids to lay other kids out, to hit them in the head, lead with the head. There's all kinds of debate going on there, but a well-trained coach is one of the key lines of defenses against youth sports violence. Set expectations for spectators. We haven't watched a lot of them, but I could have pulled up easily 100 clips that looked at spectators who got into fights, like parents and things. So, in fact, with Little League, we have a code of conduct for the parents. And that leads into the next one, establish and enforce sanctions. Unfortunately, while we have a code of conduct, it's not really enforced. People are hesitant to enforce the sanctions. But if you don't, people are going to realize there's no consequence for their actions and they're going to keep engaging in it. There's also codes of conduct for players now. Provide appropriate on-site security. If you're at a venue that gets a lot of foot traffic, a lot of spectators, then yeah, you need to have some sort of security to help players, spectators, and officials be kept safe. So wrapping it all up, violence is a really fascinating aspect of sports because it's so integral to a lot of sports, whether it's the brutal body contact or borderline violence up to the more serious criminal violence. We see that sometimes it's a strategy and it's seen as useful. So really looking at sports in terms of violence involves going beyond just the action and analyzing why it's occurring and also what values exist to promote the acceptance of those actions. And so that's all I have on violence in sports. Don't forget your next section of this is to watch the League of Denial and answer the discussion questions.